The silence of night exploded with the crack of gunfire. A woman's form collapsed, crimson spreading across her sleeve as she threw herself between danger and a man the world had learned to fear. When dawn broke, the desert highway trembled beneath thundering engines as 100 motorcycles converged on a single destination. They came not seeking vengeance, but answering a sacred call of loyalty and honor. Before our tale unfolds, please share your location in the comments below and consider subscribing to our channel. Every comment, gift, and membership sustains our mission to deliver meaningful stories that touch your heart. The electric buzz of a roadside diner's neon sign pierced the desert's quiet darkness. Within its walls, Amelia Kevin occupied a solitary booth, absently swirling lukewarm coffee. At 36, she carried herself with the bearing of a warrior who had wielded weapons on foreign battlefields across distant oceans. Her frame bore the unseen burden of service, wounds concealed beneath worn leather, haunting memories embedded within weary eyes. The townspeople knew fragments of her story. To their understanding, she remained simply the mechanic's daughter, the veteran's child who had returned home seeking solitude. Yet when silence descended, Amelia remained prisoner to echoes of warfare, the sharp report of gunfire that refused to fade from memory. On this particular evening, as desert winds swept dust across the empty parking lot, the deep rumble of motorcycle engines shattered the tranquility. 12 bikes materialized from the darkness, chrome surfaces gleaming beneath the diner's intermittent lighting. Black leather vests bore distinctive patches. The Hells Angels had arrived. Dining utensils froze in motion. Mothers drew their children nearer. Waves of anxiety swept through the establishment, but Amelia remained unmoved. She had witnessed far worse. She observed the leather-clad figures as they entered, their commanding presence filling the space, their silence more deafening than the nervous whispers around them. At the service counter, one among them requested coffee. His beard showed streaks of silver, his gaze both penetrating and battle-weary. Jack Razor Malone was his name. While others saw merely a biker, when his eyes found Amelia's, mutual recognition passed between them. Warriors recognize their own, regardless of the battlefield they've known. Razor raised his cup in subtle acknowledgement, a quiet salute. Amelia returned the gesture with a nod, the faintest smile touching her lips. The sheriff positioned himself uneasily near the entrance, his hand instinctively resting on his weapon as if violence were inevitable. The community lived in fear of these men, yet Amelia perceived something familiar in their bearing, the same haunted expression she had carried home from war. The diner's atmosphere grew heavy with unspoken tension. Razor approached the counter with measured movements, his voice low as he requested additional sugar from the waitress. To casual observers, the interaction appeared mundane, yet in that charged silence, even simple actions carried amplified significance. For one fleeting instant, peace seemed possible, but tranquility seldom endures. Beyond the windows, a tempest was building, one destined to crash through those very doors. The entrance burst open violently, the door colliding with the wall. 3 men stumbled inside, boisterous and agitated, carrying the scent of whiskey and the aura of menace. Strangers to this place, their tattoos proclaimed trouble. Their harsh laughter sliced through the room's atmosphere. One spotted Razor at the counter and muttered something venomous under his breath. Another fixed his attention on Amelia. "Hey there, soldier girl," he slurred, swaggering toward her booth. "How about buying me a drink?" His words carried mockery rather than genuine request. Amelia met his stare with unwavering calm. "Not this evening," she replied, her voice level and steady as forged steel. Razor's expression hardened, his shoulders tensing, jaw muscles twitching with restrained anger. The sheriff remained paralyzed, his fear overwhelming his sense of duty. The intoxicated man smirked, but his companion moved with sudden intent. Metal flashed beneath the diner's harsh lighting. Gun. The weapon appeared, waved carelessly in Razor's direction. The room fell into deathly silence, every heartbeat thunderous, every soul frozen in terror. This was a moment Amelia knew intimately, the pause before chaos erupts, when instinct reacts faster than conscious thought. And instinct propelled her forward. The weapon discharged. A single, deafening report. Amelia launched herself forward, her body intercepting Razor's position. The bullet tore through her arm, blood soaking her sleeve as she became his shield. Gasps erupted throughout the room. Dishes crashed to the floor. Razor caught her before she could fall, his weathered hands steady against her shoulders. "Stay with me," he commanded, his voice cracking with raw emotion. Not fear, but fury at her sacrifice. Amelia grimaced, forcing a pained smile through her agony. "Old habits," she whispered, her breathing labored. The gunman's eyes widened as the magnitude of his actions registered. Pandemonium erupted. Screams and shouts filled the air. The sheriff's hand trembled, but never drew his weapon. It wasn't law enforcement that responded that night. It was loyalty. Razor stripped off his bandana, pressing it firmly against her wound. "You saved my life," he murmured, his tone carrying more promise than gratitude. "I will not forget." Outside, engines roared to life as word spread faster than emergency sirens. The angels would learn of this, and their response would be anything but quiet. Dawn painted the desert landscape in golden hues, yet the horizon carried the sound of approaching thunder. Motorcycles appeared on the highway, one by one, their engines rumbling like an advancing storm. 10, 20, 50. By sunrise, their numbers reached 100. Leather vests gleamed in the morning light, patches blazing with significance. They had not come for bloodshed. They had come for her, Amelia Kevin, the woman who had stepped into harm's way to protect one of their brotherhood. The town stirred to consciousness, window blinds twitching, whispers spreading faster than church bells could ring. To some residents, the sight inspired terror, an army of bikers flooding Main Street. To others, it evoked awe. Razor led the procession, his face carved with determination. He had not come seeking revenge. He came because a debt of honor had been written in blood. Inside the hospital, Amelia awakened to the sound of engines beneath her window. To her ears, that sound carried no threat. It represented a promise. A soldier never forgets those who stand beside them. Neither did they. The hospital atmosphere reeked of antiseptic and stale coffee. Amelia lay propped against rigid white pillows, her arms secured with tight bandages. Each breath sent waves of pain through her body, yet her eyes remained alert and restless. She despised confinement. She loathed feeling powerless. Across the room, Razor stood like a guardian, arms folded, jaw set with resolve. He had spent the night outside her door, refusing rest, refusing to abandon his post. Hospital staff whispered about the gathering outside, their patches, their engines, their overwhelming numbers. Some felt afraid. Others experienced an unusual sense of security, as if the hospital stood protected by an army. Amelia shifted position, breaking the silence. "Your presence wasn't necessary," she muttered. Razor shook his head slowly. "Your sacrifice wasn't necessary either." Their eyes met, hers steady, his intense. Between warriors, presence spoke louder than words. Outside, engines maintained their low rumble, a constant reminder that the world had fundamentally shifted. One woman's sacrifice had awakened loyalty greater than the town had ever witnessed. News traveled swiftly, first through diners, then gas stations, finally reaching the church bulletin. By midday, the entire community buzzed with a single question: why have the Hell's Angels come? Storefronts remained partially shuttered. Parents kept children within sight. Whispers grew sharp with anxiety. Some speculated vengeance, others predicted war. But within the sheriff's office, fear transformed into panic. Law enforcement had failed to prevent the shooting, failed to protect anyone. Now 100 bikers idled on Main Street, engines growling like wolves circling firelight. The shooter remained at large, hiding somewhere, trembling in some forgotten dwelling. He had never anticipated this response. He believed it would be just one night, one reckless gunshot. But now the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of consequences. Razor paced outside the hospital, speaking into his phone, summoning brothers from distant towns. Amelia, listening from her bed, frowned with concern. "Don't let this become a bloodbath," she whispered. Razor turned, his expression softening only for her. "It won't be blood," he assured her. "It will be justice." That evening, the shooter's identity surfaced. Kyle Mercer, 27 years old, a drifter. His pockets held debts. His past held mistakes. He had fled to this small town hoping to disappear, but now the entire desert had taken notice. The bikers searched methodically, not through violence, but through relentless pressure. Gas stations refused him service. Locals turned away from him. He had become a ghost walking in daylight, hunted not by weapons, but by unwavering stares. In the hospital, Amelia sat by the window, observing row upon row of motorcycles lining the streets. The town had never witnessed such organized presence from outsiders. Razor entered, offering her a cup of hospital coffee. "He will be found," he stated quietly. Amelia studied him carefully. "And then what? You beat him? Burn down the town?" Razor's lips curved in a mirthless smile. "No, we deliver him to justice. The angels aren't lawless, despite what people believe. But respect, that belongs to us to claim." For the first time, Amelia understood this wasn't chaos. This was discipline forged on endless highways. Night descended heavily. Stars scattered like ash across the desert sky. A knock echoed at Amelia's door. A local woman appeared. Mrs. Gallagher, gray-haired, trembling, eyes wide with fear. She leaned close, whispering urgently, "They've found him by the railroad yard." Razor stiffened, then nodded once. Within moments, engines roared to life, headlights cutting through the darkness. 100 bikers moved as one, forming a wall of steel and thunder the town had never witnessed. Amelia rose from her bed despite the nurses' protests, her injured arm secured tightly. She knew this moment couldn't pass without her presence. Soldiers don't hide when their battles find them. She limped outside, taking position on the hospital steps, watching taillights disappear into the night. Her breath caught, heart pounding, not with fear, but with anticipation. The town watched as well, curtains pulled aside, children peering through cracks in doorways. It wasn't law enforcement riding out that night. It was men once feared, now carrying the burden of honor for a woman who had saved one of their own. They discovered Kyle Mercer near the rusted railroad tracks, attempting to vanish into the darkness. His hands trembled as he clutched the same pistol, though his courage had drained with every passing mile. The roar of engines surrounded him, headlights blinding, shadows towering like giants. Razor dismounted first, his movements deliberate and slow. His movements were measured and purposeful, leather groaning with each calculated step. Kyle lifted the weapon with shaking hands, the gun wavering unsteadily in his grasp. "Stop right there," Razor commanded, his voice carrying the weight of grinding stone. Time seemed suspended as the world drew a collective breath. Then footsteps emerged from the shadows, the steady rhythm of approaching boots. Amelia materialized from the darkness, her wounded arm secured in a sling, her eyes fierce despite the evident pain. "Put it down," she commanded, her tone unwavering and resolute as tempered steel. Kyle's grip weakened, his arm trembling before finally falling to his side. The bikers moved closer, their intimidation stemming not from aggression, but from their overwhelming presence. He found himself cornered, imprisoned not by force but by allegiance more binding than iron bars. Razor's gaze found Amelia's. A single nod passed between them, and Kyle Mercer at last capitulated, not to terror, but to a woman's unbreakable resolve. The sheriff's arrival came too late, his sirens piercing the desert's stillness. He emerged, Jed from his patrol car, his hand hovering uncertainly near his sidearm, eyes nervously scanning the sea of black leather surrounding him. 100 motorcyclists stood arranged in a perfect circle, their engines now silent, their stares burning through the darkness. Kyle Mercer knelt in the dust, his wrists shaking, the discarded pistol lying in the dirt beside him. For once in his life, he wasn't the most commanding presence in the room. He was the most insignificant. The sheriff attempted to establish his authority, but his voice betrayed him with a crack. He's under arrest. Not a soul stirred. Law enforcement had been nowhere to be found when it truly counted, silent while Amelia's blood had been spilled. Razor turned his attention to Amelia, waiting patiently. This decision wasn't his to make. It belonged to her. She studied Kyle intently, watching his chest rise and fall, observing the tears carving clean paths through the grime on his face. He wasn't a monster, merely a frightened man who had made a catastrophic mistake. Amelia stood straighter, her voice carrying clearly across the rail yard. "Turn him over to the authorities," she declared. The bikers followed her command, not the sheriff's orders. Respect had already selected its true leader. Kyle was hauled to his feet, his entire body trembling, his eyes darting frantically in every direction. The sheriff secured the handcuffs around his wrists, though his own hands shook as he worked the metal restraints. Kyle appeared more like a man being consumed by quicksand than one being placed under arrest. As the patrol car disappeared into the distance, Amelia remained motionless, her injured arm aching, her breathing steady and controlled. Razor approached and stood beside her, both watching the red and blue lights fade down the empty road. "Things could have taken a different turn," he muttered quietly. "Hey." Amelia gave a slight nod. "That's precisely why it had to conclude this way." Around them, the assembled bikers waited and watched, not Razor, not the sheriff, but her. Her decision had spoken with more authority than roaring engines, more power than fear itself. What filled the night air wasn't vengeance, it was dignity. For the first time in years, Amelia experienced the kind of peace she once felt when her military unit returned home safely. She was no longer just a veteran, she had become a guardian once again, and the men who had once terrorized an entire town now bowed their heads in deference to her choice. By sunrise, the bikers remained in town, their presence impossible to overlook. Storefronts opened hesitantly, cautiously, but curiosity began replacing fear. Mothers who had previously rushed their children indoors now observed as bikers assisted elderly men across streets, carried shopping bags for strangers, and stood in quiet vigil outside the hospital, serving as silent sentries. Amelia sat on the hospital steps, morning sunlight warming her face. For years, she had existed invisibly, another forgotten veteran fading into obscurity, her private struggles buried in silence. Now she was truly seen, not for her wounds or her past, but for the choice she had made when it mattered most. Razor joined her, leaning casually against the railing. "They won't forget you," he stated with certainty. Amelia offered a subtle smile. "I didn't do it for remembrance." Razor chuckled softly. "No, you did it because that's who you are at your core." Around them, the town began its slow transformation, coming to understand that strength didn't always wear a badge, and protection didn't always arrive in uniform. Sometimes it came from the highway, and sometimes from a woman who had already sacrificed more than enough. The shooter's arrest dominated morning headlines. Reporters descended upon the town, eager to capture images of 100 bikers standing, like silent guardians beneath the rising sun. But their cameras couldn't capture the real story, the quiet bond forged through bloodshed and sacrifice. In the hospital lobby, veterans gathered to pay their respects to Amelia. Some she had never encountered before, a man with a prosthetic leg, another bearing burn scars along his arms. They saluted her not with words, but with respectful silence. She acknowledged them with a nod, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Razor observed from a distance, arms crossed, allowing this moment to belong exclusively to those who truly understood. The sheriff attempted to claim responsibility before the cameras, but the townspeople knew the truth. It hadn't been his siren that saved them, it had been Amelia's bravery and the loyalty of men once feared. A young girl pressed wildflowers into Amelia's uninjured hand. "You're a hero," she whispered softly. Amelia shook her head gently. "No, I simply did what my training taught me to do." That evening, the bikers assembled outside the diner, the same establishment where everything had begun. Engines idled quietly, headlights cutting through the desert darkness. Amelia walked toward them, her sling secured tightly, each step deliberate but steady. Razor stepped forward, extending a leather vest, an angel's cut. This wasn't an invitation to membership, it was something far deeper, a symbol of profound respect. Amelia hesitated, her throat constricting with emotion. She had never required patches or public recognition, but as she slipped the vest over her shoulders, the thunder of engines erupted, not in chaos, but in tribute. The town stood watching from sidewalks, finally understanding the truth. Protection wasn't about uniforms or intimidation. It was about loyalty, sacrifice, and the courage to stand for others. Amelia raised her hand in gratitude, her voice quiet but crystal clear. We all fight battles. Some of us just fight them on different roads. The desert wind carried her words across the landscape, and for the first time in ages, she felt genuinely at peace. The following day, Main Street possessed a different atmosphere entirely. Where fear had once lingered, quiet respect now prevailed. Shop owners nodded acknowledgement to the bikers as they passed. Children waved enthusiastically, no longer hiding behind curtains. Amelia sat outside the diner sipping coffee with her bandaged arm resting on the table. Razor joined her, his presence calm and reassuring. Strange, he observed, glancing at the townspeople. Yesterday they feared us. Today they bring us homemade pie. Amelia smiled subtly. Fear comes easily. Respect requires time. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the horizon where the highway stretched endlessly. But sometimes it takes only one night to transform everything. Razor offered no argument, simply raising his cup in a silent toast. Around them, bikers shared laughter with locals, the sound raw but genuine. The sheriff maintained his distance, shame-faced, knowing that leadership had slipped beyond his reach. Amelia didn't dwell on his failure. She wasn't seeking titles or authority. She only cared that people finally saw each other without the masks of rumors or fear. Later that evening, Amelia returned to the hospital for her follow-up appointment. In the waiting room, she noticed two young soldiers in uniform, barely appearing older than 19, sitting with nervous expressions. One glanced at her sling and whispered, "Are you her?" Word had traveled farther than she had imagined. Amelia nodded quietly. The boy straightened, suddenly carrying himself taller. "My brother told me about you," he said. "Said you saved one of those bikers." She studied his face, reminded of boys she had seen deployed to combat before they had even learned to shave properly. "I didn't save a biker," Amelia replied gently. "I saved a man." Silence hung in the air momentarily. Then the boy smiled faintly, as though those words alone had given him something valuable to carry forward. Razor waited outside, leaning against his motorcycle, nodding respectfully at the soldiers as they passed. Amelia stepped out, exhaling the weight of recognition. She hadn't sought fame, but if her actions gave courage to even one young soul, perhaps the scar had been worthwhile. The next morning, the roar of engines rose one final time. The 100 bikers lined the streets, their vests gleaming under the desert sun. This time, they weren't there to surround, protect, or intimidate. They were there to say farewell. Amelia walked down the row, each rider bowing his head respectfully as she passed. It felt like walking through a corridor of loyalty, every step echoing with the weight of what had been shared between them. Razor stood at the end, his bike idling softly. "You'll be all right?" he asked with concern. Amelia nodded, though her eyes shimmered with emotion. "I've survived worse." He smirked knowingly. "Yes, but you've also made us brothers for life." She clasped his hand firmly, warrior to warrior. Then, one by one, engines roared to life, and the bikers pulled away, the thunder gradually fading into the horizon. The town stood in silence, not in fear, but in awe. For years they had told stories about the angels. Now they would tell one about Amelia Kevin. Weeks passed, but the echoes of that night persisted. The diner displayed a framed photograph of Amelia with the bikers near the counter. Veterans stopped by regularly to shake her hand. Children rode bicycles wearing toy helmets, pretending to be part of the procession that had once shaken their quiet streets. Amelia's arm healed gradually, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in years. She spent mornings repairing engines in her father's old garage, evenings sitting on the porch with coffee, listening to the desert wind. Sometimes she still awakened to memories of war, cold sweat chilling her skin. But now, when she looked out the window, She imagined the sound of engines, the promise that she was never truly alone. She had brothers on the road, unseen but always near, and in her own town she was no longer invisible. She had become proof that courage could change not only a moment, but the way an entire community perceived the world. On the anniversary of that night, a small gathering formed at the diner. Locals, veterans, and a few bikers who had ridden back just to see her. Amelia stood quietly, not at the center, but among them. No speeches, no ceremonies, just shared silence broken only by the hum of an engine in the distance. She looked around, realizing her journey hadn't ended in war or fear, but in connection. She was no longer just the mechanic's daughter. She was a protector, a reminder that sometimes courage arrives without warning in ordinary people who choose extraordinary acts. Razor caught her eye across the crowd and raised his cup once more. She returned the gesture, smiling softly. For Amelia, scars would always remain. But now, so would the bond she had forged, the kind that outlasts pain, fear, and even time itself. And as the sun set over the desert, she whispered a truth she finally believed. I am not alone. Amelia's story reminds us that true strength isn't found in power. It's found in sacrifice. One act of courage transformed fear into respect, strangers into brothers, and scars into symbols of hope. If this story touched you, like, subscribe, and press the bell icon. More stories that spark the soul are coming.